Here we are again talking about coaching and psychedelics, and we have a wonderful podcast guest today, Jevon Dangeli. I'm still struggling.
No G. Remember,
Dangeli. I tried to do it good in the beginning, but he said it's okay if I don't pronounce it right.
What's the worst butchering, Jevon?
The worst butchering of my name would be the one I grew up with, Dangeli.
Dangeli.
I grew up in South Africa, so the African people pronounce it the way they speak.
Yeah,
that would be the worst butcher.
I think that's what the Germans would go with as well.
Yeah. Das verstehe ich auch.
So we can go on in German as well.
That's good.
Very nice. So, Jevon, our first question is always like, how would you introduce yourself when you're on a party in the evening? So how do you introduce yourself when people want to get to know you? What do you do? Who you are?
Let's assume it's a party full of coaches.
Yeah, okay. I wouldn't mind who's at the party. I'd probably want to introduce myself by going onto the dance floor and just kind of moving around a bit and sort of turning around and seeing who's around, who wants to join the dance, who wants to get involved. I'd be a bit careful not to step on any toes, but that wouldn't matter either way.
And afterwards, the people can guess what you're doing professionally out of the dance.
They'll very quickly see that professionally I'm not a dancer.
That looks like an academic. Are you? I say academic just because I know you're teaching. That's how I found you. You're teaching on the Transpersonal Coaching course at Alef Trust.
That's right.
Accredited from the same university as my existential coaching masters, by the way, Middlesex. So
yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Well, we're now with Liverpool John Moores University. We've moved from Middlesex to there.
All right.
And the Transpersonal Coaching course, which I lead through Alef Trust, is accredited with the International Association of Coaches, Therapists, and Mentors. Mm-hmm. And it's a 1-year intensive online certification program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
well, that's why we're talking, because it's so related to psychedelic use, right? But let's take 2 steps back before we jump into that. What do you want people to know? I mean, it's good to have a sense for where are you speaking from, right? Who are we talking to? So what's a couple of things that you could say about who you are, other than the lovely embodied way of being in the world?
Well, I'm a father of 2 adorable children living in Switzerland, and I spend most of my working day engaging with students and clients in a coaching context, and they're around the world. And transpersonal coaching is probably my unique specialist area within the coaching profession. And transpersonal in this domain literally means going beyond the person, coaching the whole person, body, mind, spirit, and all the layers and levels in between, and working a lot with shadows, working a lot with spiritual phenomena that clients may present or which may become activated through the transpersonal coaching process. And so transpersonal coaching is very much about helping people to access the transpersonal beyond the personal, and also to understand, make sense of, and integrate those abstract, maybe even spiritual phenomena, so that they can be meaningful and useful to the person in their life. And so transpersonal coaching lends itself really well to dealing with spiritual crisis, personal development, awakening, opening. But it's also a very constructive way to help people that are very stuck in their heads, very in a linear way of thinking or living their life, to break free from those bounds and to identify what else is present and to access spiritual states that would ordinarily not be available to people. So we actually employ transpersonal processes in coaching to help individuals and groups to expand, and from that expansive state to connect with ideas and resources that would ordinarily not be available to them, and then bring that back down into the context where it's meaningful and useful to them.
Do you work more with clients, with individuals, or is it more group-wise?
50-50. Transpersonal coaching is so versatile. I personally love working with groups, As a coaching supervisor, I'm working with a supervision group on an ongoing basis. They too work with clients in an individual and in group capacities.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to jump into the group work a little bit more and also in the transpersonal model. But first of all, on the basis of what you just said, I think listeners or viewers of this will already be able to tell, probably licking their fingers around, well, there seem to be so many links to what people seek from psychedelics very often. So to make the link, and I know you've told us you're not actively, there's a limited scope of how actively you're working with clients who seek psychedelics in your coaching practice, but that the students who come to the transpersonal coaching course, there's a lot of psychedelic practitioners in there. So could you, in your views, where's that connection? How do psychedelics and coaching may or may not make sense together?
Well, first of all, I guess a lot of psychedelic practitioners and facilitators find us because of others that have done this particular course before and then started to apply that in the psychedelic context. So as sitters in psychedelic ceremonies and experiences and facilitators, they've applied our transpersonal coaching model and noticed, wow, it works really well in that context. Mm. And they've also noticed and reported to us that in terms of post-psychedelic integration, this transpersonal coaching model works really well. And so over the years, and we've been providing this course for 10 years, more and more psychedelic facilitators have found their way to our coaching course, and they're using this coaching model in their psychedelic sessions. And those that use it in a coaching context, so separate from ceremonies and ritualistic use of psychedelics, those applying it in a coaching context, we're always providing a caution around that, because we ourselves do not advocate the use of psychedelics in a coaching context. However, if they, as facilitators with their own support and supervision in that context, are then employing our coaching protocol to assist those clients to expand, connect with resources, which of course the psychedelic itself may do for them, but then to process that in a structured, or let's say semi-structured way that helps them to really make sense of it and to use it in their life in a useful way, then that's great. And along those lines, if I can illustrate this case, a psychedelic facilitator came to one of our trainings, this is many years ago, and he said to me, Jevon, I'm able to take my clients to the other end of the universe and back again. But when they come back, they've still got their problems. And so he came along to do our training. And since then, he has found that he can aid those clients on their integrative journey to come back in a very constructive way, to apply the expanded states of consciousness in the context of life in which those clients are experiencing stress, fear, anxiety, relationship problems, career issues, and all sorts of classic issues that people, like ordinary people, might experience in the real world, right? Mm-hmm. So I hope that makes sense. I'm happy to elaborate.
Yeah, that makes totally sense. I mean, this is, I think, what I oftentimes see when people come to retreats, for example, that they come again and again, but in fact, nothing changes because this integration part is not there or not sufficiently there. So this work you have to do in life, even though the psychedelics can show you something. It looks like a looper. What is the looper?
Like magnifying glasses.
Magnifying glass. So it shows you what is there, what is possible, and what maybe needs to be changed. But the psychedelic itself is not the solution. So you need somebody who accompanies you to change it in real life.
Yeah, I think so. I believe psychedelics offer the opportunity for transformation to happen, but there's certainly no guarantee. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the psychedelic, we know, can trigger less than positive experiences for people that they really struggle with. And so therein lies the value of a trained facilitator who can hold space in a constructive way to help people to process that and then, of course, integrate it constructively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When, like the training, you said training, I'm curious about what was your path to where you are now. So what brought you into coaching and regarding transpersonal coaching, this open awareness stuff. So where did you start? Was there an initial?
A long time ago. In the mid-90s, I left South Africa, where I'd been born and raised, and started backpacking the world. And after about 10 years of just fun travel, my travels kind of found their way to various spiritual retreats. And through the Himalaya and Southeast Asia, I traveled extensively around Australia and New Zealand. And I landed up at one retreat center after another out of pure curiosity and fascination. And through that very sort of global exploration and starting to work with clients in an informal coaching relationship, I saw value in learning coaching skills more constructively, so that I was not just kind of wildfire all over the place, but able to assist clients to really get value from the processes. And that then led me to the States, where I've done numerous coaching courses. And eventually I completed the Master's in Transpersonal Psychology through Alef Trust, and then joined their faculty, and then developed the Transpersonal Coaching course for Alef Trust that I had already been giving in person and continue to present in in-person settings, once per year in London, once per year in Italy. And then there's this 1-year online program as well. And that's the short version of a very long story.
Do you remember what was your first touch point with coaching? I mean, it could have been a kind of a step, it evolved and grew, but maybe there was a particular training you've done first that kind of opened the doors into this practice.
Yeah, I became an NLP practitioner in 2002. And the NLP training, which I did, was very much geared for coaching, very holistic oriented. And that was really the door opener for me into the coaching profession, which in turn led me to train with the developers of that branch of NLP known as Humanistic Neuro-Linguistic Psychology, HNLP. Mm-hmm. And John Overdurf, Julie Silverthorne were providing HNLP training in the USA in the 90s and early 2000s. They no longer do. I'm very glad to have trained with them when they still provided that course. So I became a certified NLP and HNLP trainer through them eventually, and coach and hypnotherapist. I did all of the courses that they offered. Mm-hmm. And then continued with other trainers ever since then to deepen my skills and expand the knowledge and put it to practice. Yeah.
Could you maybe, Julia, unless you have something else, I would love to dive a little bit more into transpersonal psychology, and perhaps for coaches listening or watching who are not familiar with the model. I know it's difficult to put it in a nutshell, but after as much time as you spend with this, you might have a way to tackle that. Could you give us an introduction into why transpersonal psychology matters to you and how it translates into coaching?
Sure. Great question. So transpersonal psychology is the study of the human beyond what conventional psychology has studied, which is more or less just the ego, and how in more mainstream psychology, we identify issues related to ego development. And the psychologies or interventions that have been birthed from that are all about resolving ego-based issues. And transpersonal psychology respects all of that, has learned from all of that, and has added to that what we are discovering from spiritual traditions around the world, that we are not just ego-encapsulated organisms, that there is more to us. There is more to us in the energetic space that connects us as human beings and in the space that connects us to the cosmos. And so in exploring these more abstract or spiritual phenomena, transpersonal psychologists have identified that we can actually benefit on the personal level by exploring the non-personal or non-ordinary states of consciousness that are ordinarily only available to people in spiritual practices such as meditation, psychedelic use, retreats, and a growing list of contemporary spirituality practices that have become popular in the West today and which have existed for a long time in other parts of the world. So we're learning from the traditions and with deep respect to them and what we've studied in Western psychology, merging all of that. And so transpersonal psychology today is really that merging, growing, evolving, cutting edge of psychology. And so transpersonal coaching has recognized that's a wonderful knowledge base, and we can tap into that, use that knowledge and apply it in the coaching context. It's like the action wing of transpersonal psychology.
And then how far has this knowledge that you gained changed your coaching practice? Maybe, so what was the influence?
Yeah, interestingly, I've kind of gone the other way around to what most people would. So I had that transpersonal interest before I even knew about coaching. Mm-hmm. Childhood experiences, profound experiences earlier on in my travels, as I pointed to earlier, and many, many courses to do with spiritual practices that I'd been engaging in from the 90s already were esoteric, metaphysical based, that really sparked my interest in exploring transpersonal before I even knew of that word. And so coaching in my direction came later. The recognition that we could make sense of and utilize these esoteric and metaphysical phenomena constructively to help all sorts of people in all sorts of challenging situations. Many people come the other way around. They study psychology or more mainstream coaching, and then they might deepen and expand their studies and explorations toward the kind of transpersonal or spiritual dimensions, right? So I came in from the other end.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So this is very much beyond the first generation kind of performance coaching. We have a much more holistic conversation about who people are, where people are going, how do they make sense beyond themselves as individuals. In practice, I wonder, could you tell us a story perhaps about that kind of illustrates what is it about this approach? How can we imagine that looking like in a coaching relationship over X amount of sessions?
Okay. Well, I'll relay an experience I had just this morning with a young client I was coaching. Now, this is a client who has had psychedelic experiences. I think that might be of interest to your podcast viewers. So you asked the question, this is the first account that comes to mind. Mm-hmm. Yet, despite his interest and experience in the use of psychedelics, struggles in the personal domain with the kinds of issues anybody would struggle with in life: decision-making, stress related to study, looking around at what's happening in the world today. We might ask ourselves, what does the future look like for this and for future generations? So existential issues. And all of us living in this body today might be able to relate to that. Right? So from a transpersonal perspective, then, what we apply, and I'm demonstrating this with my hands now, are various means to identify what his attention is fixated on. Because any stressor, any cause of pain, anxiety, any negative state, anything a client will ever present in coaching is the result of their attention being narrowly fixated on the trigger. And that attention will be conscious or unconscious. Nevertheless, a narrowly fixated attention on the trigger of the presenting problem. So what we do in transpersonal coaching is we help clients to identify what their attention is fixated on. And then we go from that fixated mode of attention to an open aperture of awareness. And we facilitate processes that literally create open awareness in this way. So I teach clients all sorts of exercises, like the very one I'm demonstrating here, to inhale through the nose, exhale from the mouth. And as you exhale from the mouth, allow your visual field of awareness to open up beyond your screen and to become aware of what's over there and what's over there in the room around you. And so if you think about that, and as you're looking at your screen, and allow your visual field to expand simultaneously, to be loosely, in a defocused way, aware of what's over there in your periphery. And if you couple that with an inhale through the nose and a long, slow exhalation to expand that awareness outward, there you have a very simple, easy to replicate skill, which, when applied in the presence of that trigger, enables you to disidentify from the part that's being triggered, and in turn enables you to have an expanded perception and a more calm, embodied, resourceful state in which you can then choose to engage more consciously with what's triggering you. So we can see how this very gentle, simple transpersonal skill of open awareness helps clients to adjust the way they're perceiving the trigger, and in turn have a more calm, resourceful, and expanded response to that triggering scenario. A very simplistic example, I can elaborate on that.
You read my mind. I wonder how that showed up with that client that you just mentioned. I appreciate we should respect confidentiality, but can you go into any detail about what happened there and how that manifested?
Sure. So he would present a specific example in a context in which he's being triggered. I won't get into any revealing details, but let's just say there is a notification on his computer about a deadline that's coming up. And that notification instills a lot of anxiety and panic inside him because that deadline's coming very fast.
While the attention is focused.
There you go. You've got fixated attention on that specific detail. That's the trigger. He was fine until that notification popped onto his screen. Now he's no longer fine because he's been triggered. So if I use that example of looking at the screen and at the same time being softly aware of what's in the entire room around you, inhale through the nose, long, slow, releasing out breath from the mouth, expand awareness outward. And now, in the expanded state, which one can calibrate to, you see a softening of the skin in the face tonicity. The body relaxes. They sink into their seat more. They become relaxed, more open and receptive, and we can calibrate to a physiological response. We then say, now that you're in open awareness, think about that trigger again, in this case, the notification on the screen. And what's different now as you pay attention to that? And suddenly the client starts to report, well, it's not such a big deal. Oh, I haven't really thought about it like this before. I could actually just do this or that type of action, which will get me moving forward. Whereas before I was just procrastinating and I thought it was such a big deal, but it's really not. That type of response is the one we expect and which we readily get from clients.
Right. So it doesn't have to be a huge, life-changing, spiritual, existential question. You can literally apply this model with quite day-to-day challenges that people run into.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, I've attended many spiritual retreats, be among very many spiritual people. And I would go to the next retreat and meet the next group of people. And lo and behold, there were always those people that came back again and again and again, because it was only in that session setting where they felt at home, where they were peaceful. And they were unable to transfer their spiritual realizations and awareness into the context of everyday life. And so these experiences in the late 90s, early 2000s already sparked me off going, well, how is it that we struggle to transfer these wonderful spiritual and or psychedelic experiences into the rest of life? Why can't we make those connections? And that got me thinking along the lines that led to the development of the transpersonal coaching model. But there must be ways in which we can embody spiritual insights so that they're not just states, but traits, embodied traits, ways of being that can be activated and applied in the real world with even these kind of mundane problems that, of course, are not mundane when they happen to us.
What do you think is the most rewarding in your work? Because I see you're smiling a lot, and when you talk, it feels like you're very happy with what you're doing. So what would you say is the most rewarding of the work you're doing?
Yes. Well, every day those rewards are noticeable. The kind of verbal and non-verbal feedback that we as transpersonal coaches receive from clients is about transformation. It's about them being liberated from problems that they felt really weighed down by. So clients experience a freeing of themselves from things that they might have thought they could never be free of. Some clients ask before a session, if they're a new client and haven't experienced this type of coaching before, so what can coaching do for me? I've got this dilemma, and they describe it in detail, and they say, there's no way through, there's no way over, there's no way under, there's no way out of this problem. So why should I come for coaching? And my response to that is quite often, well, I don't know. I honestly do not know what coaching is going to do for you. But what I do know is that this process will enable you to view that situation in a completely different way, a way that I cannot even begin to describe in words. And when you do view that situation in this whole new way, and whole is an important word here, then you're going to think and feel differently about it, which will in turn lead to ideas and responses that you haven't even begun to think about yet. So how about we give it a try? And clients go through that process, and they do arrive at new perspectives, and they do find new, more resourceful responses for which they are extremely grateful. And that's why I love this work.
Mm-hmm. And that's what very often people seek psychedelic experiences for. They want to live more fully. They want to live more holistically. They have something that they're trying to wrap their head around, at least when you use spiritual psychedelic experiences to work with. I think it's very different if somebody has a psychedelic experience with friends in the park because it just happened and you use it recreationally. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about here somebody coming in to the coaching space or into any space with an intention to learn, to grow, to have an insight on something, to resolve something. They want to come in and do some work. So I wonder, you mentioned quite a lot of the students of the course, people you've met along the way, they're using the transpersonal model in their coaching work with people who seek psychedelic experiences. I'm assuming you must have heard a bunch of kind of case studies or what students bring into the course. Can you think of some examples that maybe have been brought to you or that you came across or people you've worked with yourself, where specifically in the context of seeking something through psychedelic experiences, that model applies really well?
Yeah, I'm trying to make sense of the question in a way that leads me to a particular example. So let's see, a particular client I'm recalling, one that I've worked with, is somebody who, through psychedelic experiences by themselves, because he was using them not in a ceremonious way, not with the facilitator that's guiding them in that manner, but more recreationally, although not at a party, home alone with a few friends that cared deeply about each other. Nevertheless, that set and setting by itself was not so conducive for this client to have a meaningful experience, to overcome some of the challenges. Yet, the psychedelic experience in that setting was still profound and enabled the client to have a completely different view of themselves and of reality. So in the coaching session, then, what we did was I associated the client back into that state. And how could you possibly, if you've had a psychedelic experience and then through talking to somebody else later on, days or weeks or months later, be reassociated into that. You probably think, well, I don't know if that's even possible without microdosing at very least in the coaching session itself. Well, through the application of open awareness and deepening the open awareness state, we just went 180 degrees a bit earlier, but you can go 360, metaphorically speaking. You can expand awareness in profound ways through very gentle, facilitated processes that are conducive to coaching. So you don't have to close your eyes, you don't have to do anything fancy. And so their application in a coaching context is most suitable. And then through guiding the client into open awareness, then plugging back into a residue of the psychedelic experience so that we could then harvest the golden nuggets, because they weren't harvested in the session. He hadn't yet reaped what I might consider the full benefit of the psychedelic. Mm-hmm. So now we re-access that state lightly in the coaching session, and then we harvested the golden nugget. So what's the value of that unitive consciousness that you experienced there? Mm-hmm. What does that mean about you and your life? And how does that meaning then add value or have use in the presenting issue, the context of the presenting issue here?
Yeah.
And so he was able to build that bridge, which he hadn't built before. And that's how our transpersonal coaching model works. I want to be clear, this is not the transpersonal psychology model. It's a specific transpersonal coaching model, TCM, that we've been developing over the past 20 years. That's taught only in this particular course that I've been referring to. Mm-hmm. And the use of that model then builds that bridge from the psychedelic encounter into the day-to-day experiences where we'd like to have those psychedelic states and ideas available to us.
Yeah. It sounds potentially risky to bring somebody back into a state where if it's a very blissful state, probably much less risk. But if I'm thinking somebody experienced something quite challenging, quite uncomfortable, and they want to learn what was going on there, what they can learn from it, how do you navigate that in the way that it's safe in coaching? You said it's quite gentle. Could you say a bit more about that?
That's a great question. Thank you. So we have various ways of entering into open awareness. And one of them is a very somatically oriented open awareness. It's very much in and around the body as opposed to being out there. And if the client's presenting issue has to do with a psychedelic encounter that was less than positive for them, maybe terrifying, maybe it caused a lot of fragmentation and they really feel like they cannot cope with even simple things in life right now. They may even be experiencing a spiritual emergency, which is a rapid and sudden emergence of spiritual phenomena in the individual's consciousness, which we study in transpersonal psychology. So any of these less than positive states that might have been triggered by the psychedelic experience would be a cue to the coach to keep the open awareness process somatically oriented. Let's not go out there. Let's stay here in this body. And when you drop awareness out of the thinking mind, which is ordinarily more heady, more cerebral, and just into the body, becoming present in the visceral, unfolding, dynamic experience of this present moment through the body, it is a transpersonal state. It's not a normal or ordinary state of consciousness. It's a safe, non-ordinary state of consciousness, which is kind of a stepping stone between the ordinary state and the radical non-ordinary state of the psychedelic experience. It's that bridge in between the two, which we call the liminal state or space in transpersonal coaching. So we help the client to enter into that liminality that is between this state and that state in order to build the bridge between states and to make sense of experiences in that way. That's quite an abstract example. I wonder if you'd like me to pin that down and give some more example of how that works.
As more tangible as we can get, the better, I think.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to come back to your question about, let's say it was not a good state. The client's coming back. They're struggling to make sense of a fragmented experience, because since they had this profound experience, now they must carry on in this role and that work situation. The two, they cannot reconcile, right? So what I've done with clients who've presented issues of that kind in the past is we have, through a set of sessions, helped them to anchor open somatic awareness so that it, as a resource state in and of itself, can become something that's easy to access in the work situation. I'll use a certain work scenario. So I'm thinking of a client who works in a corporate context, very different paradigm from the psychedelic experience that they'd reported. So through these successive sessions, they learned to get out of their heads and be more present in their bodies, because whenever they were overthinking, having those ruminating thoughts about what's wrong in the situation, they were getting lost in that liminal space. But it's interesting, because this liminal space between what was and what is neither positive nor negative, can be positive, can be negative. It depends on the quality of presence that the person brings to that state. So what we help them to do is to have a positive quality of experience of liminality. And so the somatic-oriented open awareness that we would guide the client into is a very present, here and now, positive feeling of liminality. It's non-identified with a part of the psyche, with the role at work, or with what happened there and then, and is pure presence. It's where Eckhart Tolle's power of now starts to move into action. That's the liminal state between pure presence and what is emerging from pure presence, the next step. The next step the person can take in that work scenario. So they learn to be productive at work, or they learn to be effective in their approach to entering into the liminal state through the body, and then extracting from that state, what action do I want to take? They learn to trust intuition, the intelligence of the body, and to tap into that intentionally, and then apply what they realize or discover from that state by taking one next step in the context where that matters. So that's then the action wing of the transpersonal. It's being transferred into action, and the actions are very typically ecological. And ecological in this context means that the action they choose to take serves them very well, serves the other people in that context with whom they are interacting, and serves the greater environment. Win, win, win. So the actions stemming from open awareness are inherently ecological, beneficial to self, others, and environment, or earth for that matter.
And is that an agenda that the coach brings in, or a byproduct of the work for the client?
It's a byproduct. We certainly don't bring our agenda into the process. Mm-hmm. Transpersonal coaching is completely client process oriented. And it was interesting to observe over the years how, when clients expressed the action they felt inspired to take, which stemmed from open awareness, those actions were naturally ecological. So they were actions that were going to benefit the client, those that they were interacting with, and the broader environment or the context in which they were interacting. And so we concluded that open awareness is naturally ecological.
I'd love to hear a bit more about open awareness. You talked about it. I read there's a model behind it. And could you tell us a bit about how a coach might create that? There seems to be a particular way of doing that. If you could say a bit more about that, that would be really cool.
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. So open awareness is in fact at the very core of our transpersonal coaching model. The model itself is very intricate and has many variations that can be applied depending on the presenting issue. But I always like to remind students and the coaches whom we supervise that open awareness is at the core of this model. And open awareness is the co-created held space that the client and the coach, and that means all the clients, could be a big group of clients, that we co-create. Is the participatory space which we enter into together. So as I open the aperture of my awareness and offer the client a few words to aid them into entering open awareness at the same time, as we take a few conscious breaths together and enter into that space, we attune our consciousness. We come into the co-created field, and it's within this shared held space that the coaching process unfolds. What this does is it cultivates a deep sense of rapport between the coach and the client, a sense of connectedness. And whether the client notices this consciously or unconsciously, it occurs very naturally. Just the same way as open awareness is inherently ecological, so too does it cultivate this deeper sense of interconnectedness between self and other. And eventually, as the practice deepens, the boundary between self and other almost becomes diffused to the point of non-existent, in which a unity consciousness begins to be felt, similar to the psychedelic experience. Nevertheless, open awareness still enables the client to be very discerning between what is theirs and what is the client's. So if there is a lot of emotional outpouring from the client, and we've diffused the boundary between self and other, the coach does not absorb that. In fact, they become much more aware of what is shifting and moving energetically in the co-created space, which in turn enables them to not be overwhelmed by the client's story and energy and so forth. So that's an interesting phenomenon. So we enter into open awareness together, and the coach then intentionally takes their expanded field of open awareness, and as I'm gesturing with my hands now, holds the client in that. They intentionally envelope the client in their open awareness. They don't have to verbalize to the client, oh, by the way, I'm wrapping you in my open awareness at the moment. But that's just the mere intention to do so. What that does is it creates the held space in which the client feels safe. There's a lot of compassion going on in that space. And we're able to listen attentively and generatively as coaches. And as you might appreciate, when a coach has that quality of presence with another, that quality of relationship, it's deeply healing in and of itself. Mm-hmm. Clients feel heard, they feel held, they can finally feel safe enough to talk about the things they haven't been brave enough to confront or express before. Mm-hmm. And so just that quality of presence serves the coaching relationship in such a profoundly constructive and wonderful way that I like to say the rest is details. Any other coaching questions, techniques, or models you may like to then bring are secondary. This is how we start, and very often this is how it ends. And the clients gain their insights and get moving in their life just through that space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that sounds amazing.
Goes to show how it is in the relationship, right? As we get the relationship right, the space that is held in a way where the coach has done their work, their personal work, to show up in a way that can really hold that space. That's why some people come into coaching with relatively little coaching experience as such, but they bring a presence that is the foundation of all of this work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed. That's amazing. And that quality of a presence can come through many years of experience. Some of our students on the course are very mature. They are, in fact, retired people who don't want to give up being of service in the world, and they come along to learn these coaching skills to then apply them in their mature years. But they themselves, through having been psychologists or coaches for many years, have developed that quality of presence that's just so wonderful to be in. But I also love to remind younger, less experienced coaches who are going through this learning program, that you can learn to have that quality of presence through the simple open awareness skills and this intentionality to hold space in this way. And clients will feel that and benefit from it. You don't have to have decades of experience to nurture that participatory space in this way.
That brings me to a question of what do you think is important for becoming a coach in maybe your direction? So what kind of people, you already talked a bit about it, what people apply, but what do you think is important or should they bring with them to go this path?
And maybe have the psychedelic angle in mind. So working with coaches who want to apply that in the psychedelic space, what do they need to know?
Yes, another great question. I think it's important to have the calling to want to be of service in some way. Because you can do coaching in the more mainstream, more corporate-like environment and just go in there and it's protocol and it's procedural and you can do that work, and if that lights you up, good. Those types of coaches who are interested in it for those reasons don't tend to become our students. Our students are those who feel there's more to being a human and they feel called to help others to awaken these innate potentials, to enliven their authentic selves, and to be part of the kind of change that we all want to experience in this life, pardon the cliche. So people that want to be of service in a profound way. Now, I believe that those who feel interested in working with psychedelics, it's because there's a recognition that our ordinary states of consciousness are but just one band along which we can experience a singular dimension of ourselves in this reality. And that the psychedelic experience opens that to a seemingly infinite range of more ways of experiencing oneself. And so that inclination to want to explore that and to support others in expanding in such a way is the same. That's why people would come to our course, because they recognize, I want to help people to have that experience. I'd like to add that a lot of our students do not have an interest in the psychedelic at all, for their own reasons, which we respect, but they do recognize that expanded states of consciousness are imperative if we're going to help people to overcome all sorts of issues that are presented these days. And so they are coming to learn ways to facilitate expanded states of consciousness in a coaching relationship that do not necessarily require the use of psychedelics, but can work with psychedelics in a constructive way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe just sorry, Yannick.
No, go ahead.
I was wondering, I mean, when you work with open awareness, and maybe you have somebody from the corporate world who's very minded and who's working very strict schedules, and they maybe don't have that much experience with working with their body and open awareness and everything. So maybe sometimes with the work you do, you tap into things that were not visible, that were unknown until now. And maybe from a coaching perspective, that might become more a therapy perspective. So what do you think about the differences of coaching and therapy, and how far is it important, or how far do you train people on making this difference and how to react on that?
Yeah, you're asking such great questions. And similar to yourselves, I speak to all sorts of professionals who walk that fine line between coaching and therapy, the gray zone, that slippery line between where coaching and therapy meet. Now, from a transpersonal perspective, that line becomes even more gray, because as clients expand beyond their ordinary ways of perceiving themselves, tap into levels of creativity and ideas that have never occurred to them before, they may also open Pandora's box to a whole lot of unconscious material of their past, perhaps. There may be trauma there. So as transpersonal coaches, trained to hold space for any and all types of phenomena, as I was referring to earlier, we're also trained to hold space for whatever might show up from the unconscious. And it might be a memory of a difficult experience. It might be a memory of a wound or traumatic period in the person's life that they've suddenly become aware of, and that's now what's present for them in the coaching session. By holding space in this way, bringing that experience into this compassionate field, those clients have the opportunity to not only confront those unhealed wounds of the past, but to process them constructively in the present moment without digging up things in the past, without associating into those memories, as in robust old school psychotherapy. Go into that memory, and how does that make you feel? And then what happened? And how does that make you feel? And the clients are in it, and they're struggling, and they're trying to kind of contend with all of this difficult material of their past. We don't do that. We kind of zoom out. We look at life as a whole. That's open awareness. And there in the past, there is an experience, the one that you've just been speaking about. And I would say to my client in such an example, now I want you to see that experience as a distant memory way back there in your timeline. And I want you to notice what happened all the way over there and see who else is involved. And from this broader perspective, I want you to now attune yourself with your source of aliveness, whatever it is that makes you feel good, that nourishes and nurtures you, to your source of love and wisdom. And if I know anything about my client's personal history, I'll layer in that wording there. If I know something about their values, religious beliefs, and so on, just so that they can tap into whatever that source of aliveness is for them. I say, now channel that into that memory so that you can provide to yourself over there whatever it is that was missing to him or her at the time.
Right.
Get the learning so that you can release that and notice how the transformation in terms of how you interpret that meaning, the meaning of that memory of that event can transform like a domino effect, rippling up through your life to the present time. So that's how we work with this type of phenomena of a traumatic nature. And that's just a piece of the puzzle, by the way. I have not given the entire, this is how we resolve trauma.
Have you not? I'll give you 2 more minutes. There it is again, that if somebody's stuck with their attention on something that stops them from moving forward or stops them from feeling good or better or, whatever they want to achieve, you use those techniques or this holding to release some of that grip of where their attention is and encourage them to zoom out, get more of a perspective so they understand that, well, that's a small part of me. But occasionally that comes back, right? So occasionally those traumatic experiences, however we might define them, something just has a hold on our clients. So they find it really difficult to engage with moving forward, focusing on something positive, zooming out, because they keep falling into that groove. So I wonder, when and how would you refer someone out? Where's the limit of what the coaching approach can do?
Yeah, well, I do think that the conventional, more traditional corporate style coaching has more limits than a transpersonal orientation would, because we're not so quick to say, oh, heck, that's something of the past. There seems to be a trauma there. I must stop the session immediately and send you to a psychotherapist. We hold space for the entire duration of that session so the client gets value from it. We also recognize that if the clients have a presenting problem that just keeps perpetuating in their life and keeps showing up, it's most probably the result of an early life trauma. And that there's a part of them that keeps that problem stuck. That's why it keeps happening in their life. And that part of them is probably a protective mechanism. It's the kind of survival or protective part of the psyche that keeps showing up because it's protecting the client from experiencing the pain of that earlier life trauma. Transpersonal coaching is trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. So we're working with the cartography of the psyche that starts even before conception, but certainly works with the whole person from the moment of conception to now, recognizing all the stages of development. So we're informed by transpersonal psychology and this vast cartography of the psyche that enables transpersonal coaches to work with all of these different phenomena. And this perpetuating problem is then very often identified as the mechanism that a part of the unconscious mind has developed to protect them from the pain of an earlier life trauma. And when we establish the intention of the protective mechanism, the client as an authentic self observing that mechanism at play gets into a dialogue with that part of themselves and simply holds space, self-compassion, holds space for that part of themselves that's behaving in that way. With my client earlier today, there was a teenage part that was protecting the client from feeling the pain of a much younger part at age 3 that was traumatized. Mm-hmm. And the teenage part was showing up, and this client was struggling in his life today because the teenage part is still at play, not taking things seriously enough, not planning ahead, procrastinating, not wanting to grow up, not wanting to become an adult. Because the teenage part came into existence to prevent the client from moving away from the playfulness and lightness of life. Mm. So understanding the needs of that part, as we can do in this open awareness state, helps the client to be in dialogue with that part, and in so doing, integrate that part, so it's no longer upsetting them, no longer perpetuating that pattern. The client becomes a more fully functional whole, that is the authentic self. And as the authentic self can then move forward in their life with all parts playing for the same team.
Yeah, so there seems to be a really good match with multiplicity theories like IFS, internal family systems, theories of self that go beyond this one version of the self.
Yes, internal family systems is a wonderful way of working with parts, and it is in many ways very similar to what we do in transpersonal coaching too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wonder, have you referred clients out from your practice? I mean, you seem to have gathered a lot of experience across many different disciplines, and the transpersonal model lends itself to go much beyond that. Would call it a gray area, a huge gray area. In existential coaching, it's similar. It's difficult to pinpoint a line, but surely you have found some lines, or at an end of that gray area, when it isn't gray anymore. What do you say? I guess I'm asking the question because in psychedelic coaching, it's much more likely that we find ourselves practicing with someone that started like a coaching engagement, and then there was an experience, and all of a sudden all of these doors opened, and some of those doors, they're much better walked through not with a coach or not with whoever is the coach at that moment. And I wanted to give people like a tangible ways of respectfully referring out so that the client doesn't feel left alone, but they feel even better supported.
Yeah, that's very constructive, I think important. So we like to differentiate between spiritual emergency and psychosis. And in transpersonal psychology, we study what differentiates psychosis from spiritual emergency. A spiritual emergency can look and feel like a psychosis, in which the person feels fragmented, in which they don't know which part of themselves is most real and how to be in the world at all. One differentiating factor that we identify between psychosis and spiritual emergency is the person in spiritual emergency knows that they're having a difficult time and that they will, sooner or later, with help, overcome it. And it's as if they're in an ocean, but they can swim. The person in psychosis cannot swim. They drown in that ocean, and they need help. They need somebody to throw them the life vest. So interestingly, many psychiatrists and psychologists do transpersonal coaching, and therefore we have in our network a list of more clinically and medically trained healthcare professionals who value the transpersonal. And I would not send a client to somebody who I did not trust to have a deep, rich understanding of transpersonal phenomena so that they can discern, is this client having a spiritual awakening emergency, or are they really suffering from psychosis, in which case particular types of clinical care and maybe even medication may be useful. So I don't make any such decisions. If I notice the person's drowning, I refer them. If I notice they're struggling to stay afloat, but they're there, they're going to get through this, and it's an intuitive decision. There's no clear-cut, well, they check all these boxes, therefore they're suitable for coaching, and there's this one that they don't, therefore they're not. There's no such checkbox for this, but there are criteria that we can identify that differentiate between psychopathologies and somebody who's just having a really difficult time.
Mm. And I'd love to pick you up on that metaphor of holding the person. And you made this lovely hand movement of like embracing the space in front of you where this client is held. I think when we struggle as coaches or as practitioners to hold the space, if it's too heavy or the client keeps breaking out into things, or it just doesn't feel like you're managing to hold that space safely and gently, I think at that point, it's really important we ask ourselves whether we're the right person to work with this client.
Yeah, that's great. If you cannot hold space for the client, something's coming up in you and it just makes you feel uncomfortable with that client, and you're not overcoming that through your own, whatever you might use to address it, you probably would do well to refer the client. I'd also like to emphasize the value of supervision. Coaches should be undergoing supervision, especially when you're working in the context of transpersonal phenomena, psychedelics. You need to have your own support structure in place, peer support, professional support, both, and receive guidance from those that bring yet another perspective to what you're presenting in relationship with that particular client. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. Julia, do you have any more questions, or is it maybe a good time to move into our last part of the podcast?
I think it's a good part to go there because you answered all the questions we had. I think. So
I can think of a few more, but I think that's all the ones we had written down. So that's fantastic. And also
plastics. Yeah. So we have a list of questions that we always ask, like our quick fire questions. And since you've done so many things and you've read so many things, are there a few books that you would recommend that people could read to know more, to have an open mind, open awareness, opening the awareness more?
Well, how about the Open Awareness Handbook then?
Perfect.
That would be one that I recommend. And I'd be pleased to let anybody listening know that that is, in fact, a free ebook, which I have authored. It's in its second edition, and I'm very glad to offer that as a free resource to anybody listening to this. So if possible, I'll make the link available.
Please do. Yeah. And I saw it's on your website, is it?
You can access that free download on my website, yeah.
Can you just spell it out for people? Just so if somebody's super excited about it right now, they can jump straight to it.
Yeah, sure. It's the Open Awareness Handbook. And it's available on my personal website, jevondangeli.com, among the other 9 books which I've written that all relate to this topic. Yeah.
Fantastic. So put the link in there.
The other one that I would highly recommend, this one's not for free though, because it's a much larger volume, updated just this year to the 3rd edition, is the Transpersonal Coaching Handbook. in which I share all the different variations of the transpersonal coaching model in all its shapes and forms and all the different contexts that it can be applied. And their contributory authors that have added sections to that book, they're all professional transpersonal coaches using this particular model, all offering their own perspective on its use in varieties of contexts as well. Mm-hmm. So that's a really useful resource, 345 pages. No, that was the last edition, excuse me. This one's 400 and something pages, and every page offers you practical value. So the Transpersonal Coaching Handbook is another one. Then, the people who I read a lot of and whose teachings I appreciate deeply, the work of Gabor Mate. I'm sure you've heard of him. Then Daniel Siegel, he's written a lot on the developmental stages and detachment theory, and his teachings have direct application in coaching. And I'm wondering, there's somebody I interviewed recently. Fortunately, I have this book right here. I wasn't expecting your question, but I'm glad to have Coaching and Trauma here. Yeah. And I interviewed
Sarah Vaughan Smith. She's fantastic. I've met her a few times.
There you go. I interviewed her recently, and she would confirm everything I've shared with you today regarding coaching and trauma. And her book, Coaching and Trauma, is very accessible. It's available on Amazon. It translates trauma work for coaching practitioners in a very easy to reach way that coaches can make sense of.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. What do you think about regulation, Jevon? Is that something we need more of for protection of our clients? Is that something that's in the way of good people entering the industry? And this could be of coaching in general, could be transpersonal coaching particularly. What do you think?
So regulatory bodies you were referring to. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's good that regulatory bodies exist in coaching, because otherwise it would be too wildfire. There'd be a lot of people who are not qualified calling themselves coaches, going out there and diluting and maybe even dirtying the waters of the coaching profession. So I'm very glad that regulatory bodies such as ICF and the Association for Coaching and the International Association of Coaches, Therapists, and Mentors have come into existence. There are others too. And these independent self-regulatory bodies have their own, policies and criteria and ethics that their accreditees, or whatever they might be called, need to comply with. And I believe it is useful that they are in place. But what I think is important is that these regulatory bodies update what they believe to be ethical, ethics in coaching and coaching competencies, so that the value of a transpersonal perspective is understood and acknowledged. Now, of course, I wave that flag, and I have my bias because I am a transpersonal coach. But one thing that a lot of regulatory bodies do not yet know about or value is the emergence of this transpersonal field within coaching. So IACTM, the International Association of Coaches, Therapists, and Mentors, is one of those regulatory bodies that do value the transpersonal perspective, and it upholds transpersonal coaching very highly. So, of course, that's why I mentioned it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And maybe a question regarding future trends regarding coaching and psychedelics. Since you said, okay, in the program, there are some people who use psychedelics, some not. And maybe you have an idea regarding the future, especially for me, it's interesting to see where the link is to the corporate world as well. Like maybe are there more people in the future opening up their mind for altered states in general, and maybe specifically in psychedelics?
Yeah. Well, David Luke is one of my colleagues at Alef Trust, and he speaks about the psychedelic renaissance that we're experiencing in the world today, and how through the legalization of psychedelic testing and use around the world. We're, making it more accessible to people. There are questions and concerns about that. Are we taking the sacred plants out of the jungle where they should remain? Are the shamans who are the space holders of these traditions not supposed to be adhering to their traditional set and settings in those ways, as opposed to being compelled by lots of money to come out and host ceremonies here in the West? So there are lots of questions around that. Nevertheless, we need to acknowledge that a lot of people who are really stuck in tunnel awareness might never find themselves out of that very narrow perspective in life unless given the opportunity to blast that awareness open if it's necessary. Because a lot of people are not going to sit and meditate. They're not going to do yoga. They're not going to engage in open awareness practices. They're not going to do any of that because there's no time for any of that. They've got work to do and other priorities. So if given the opportunity to sit once and have a psychedelic experience in which a whole new world is revealed to them, then such individuals can benefit from the psychedelic encounter. But in so doing, as per what we've already discussed in today's session, there are many implications. And that's where I see the role of transpersonal coaching coming in, so that we can hold space in a constructive way for those and other individuals, help them to integrate post-session in a way that is very unique to that person and their needs, which is what the transpersonal coaching model is all about.
Mm. Any words of warning or maybe any advice to a coach who is entering this field? Maybe something you wish you would have known when you started out.
Specific with regards to psychedelics?
That would be great, but transpersonal, given that that's predominantly your field, would do as well.
Yes, both the psychedelic world and the transpersonal coaching world are going to open you up. I can speak from direct experience from transpersonal coaching. You'll be very glad about the way in which you have opened the aperture of your perspective and the value which that brings to your life. With regard to psychedelics, we don't know what you will confront when you're opened up in that manner, because it can be quite robust. So that's why microdosing is important for certain individuals. You get to just kind of dip your toes in the water. I think that has great value in a therapeutic and maybe even in a coaching setting. So more robust ways of engaging with stronger doses. I have some ethical concerns around that. I think the facilitator or practitioner needs to have a lot of experience being in those settings with the space held for them. And then as they shift into being sitters or facilitators, being supervised by others in a peer-to-peer managed, controlled like setting, long before they ever start to do this work with others as professional facilitators. And I think it's a long journey of training and integration on the personal level and in terms of familiarity with the psychedelic before such a person should start to do that work. And I believe they have years and years of preparation to undergo before they should be allowed to do that work with other individuals.
Oh yeah, I would draw very clear lines between coaching to help somebody prepare or integrate and sitting or guiding, being with somebody during an experience. That's has so much responsibility holding that kind of space. People become very vulnerable when they are in a psychedelic state. I mean, vulnerable as in the technical term. It's easy to assert influence. So I cannot underline what you said enough to really encourage coaches to think about where they draw their lines. I know there's plenty of coaches who are also sitting and guiding, but it takes a very different skill set and I believe a lot more knowledge than when you meet someone following a psychedelic experience to help them make sense of what the hell just happened and how do they take that forward into their lives.
Absolutely. I think they're very complementary modalities, psychedelic work and transpersonal coaching. They fit together very well, but they're two different disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you already talked a bit about your clients, but maybe is there a client that was especially memorable, where that always pops up when you think about your clients? There's one that jumps out every time that you can remember.
Oh, well, where do I go?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There are so many. So I'm trying to contextualize it with regards to psychedelics now. And I think the statement from a client recently that nothing has brought her closer to the psychedelic experience as that of the open awareness experience. And the open awareness experience that she was referring to was one that we as a group had just entered into together for 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So I guided a group into open awareness, and then we explored the state of open awareness, and we brought it back out and into discussion to explore what the value of that open awareness state was like. And she explained that her experience of just where she went in those 10 minutes was equal to the most profound psychedelic experience that she had ever had. And that was really impressive to hear. And at the same time, she'd come out of it, and there she was in her body, in the space, ready to carry on with her work and life as usual. So there are no implications other than positive spillover effects. Open awareness is a wonderful resourceful state, which when channeled into whichever area is very useful to the person. So that was a very positive remark, and not unlike other feedback that I have received as clients experience open awareness. Mm-hmm. So I said earlier, not a lot of people will meditate or be willing to do that or this type of practice because it requires too much time and input. And it's to these clients where I say, well, what would happen if we just sat and took a few breaths together and you imagined right now tuning into the entire volume of space that your whole body occupies? Just imagine attuning with the entire volume of space that your whole body occupies. And what's that like for you right now? And what's possible for you now? So if you really did follow through with that little spontaneous note there.
Difficult not to.
It's out of here, and it's all the way here, and it's all the way here. And you can quickly translate that with coaching questions into a forward momentum according to the client's needs. So that's a quick example of how we might use it in a coaching context.
Wow, this may or may not already be the answer to the next question, which is also our last question, sort of. If you could take over the screen of any person or group of people, have their undivided attention for a minute, I wonder whose attention you would want to hold for a minute, and what would you tell them?
Whose attention I would want to hold?
Yeah, if you had the attention of any person or group of people, you could talk to Trump directly, or you could talk to the whole world, or, just South Africa, to pronounce the name right and not butcher it.
Who would I want to speak to? The rescuer in me wants to jump in and say, wow, we need to change many issues in the world, and I want to speak to that political party and have them be an open awareness and see how to really approach that situation differently. But then which political party do we choose? Politics is inherently problematic. Mm-hmm. So, but of course, the change maker in me wants to work with those people, and the change maker is a conglomerate of parts of which my rescuer is part. And so without trying to rescue anything or be a hero, it's difficult for me to name a particular example. I guess I'd want to sit with highly influential people and introduce them to open awareness. Because I'm convinced of one thing: when they know about it, highly influential people will want to convey that more into the world. And because of their means to do so, we'd see a ripple effect of change that it can only be positive because it's ecological.
Great. Fantastic.
Sounds like a good message.
Indeed. That's it.
Maybe just the last question, if somebody wants to find you and wants to work with you, so where should people go? Where can they find you?
I have a website, jevondangeli.com, so my full first name and surname.com. And on that site, you will find 44 training videos, 50 odd free podcast recordings, a couple of free ebooks, and a lot of free resources and publications on the topic we've been discussing today. It's all for free. And then sessions can be booked. There's some sellable products and courses as well, if you're interested. So feel free to check that out.
Perfect. We'll put that into the show notes for sure.
Wonderful. Well, with that, there's only to say thank you. It's been really good to see your wisdom, your knowledge, your energy that you're putting into the space. And you very clearly are on a mission to bring open awareness out into the world. It's inspiring to hear you talk and to hear you teach and to hear you share your what you know and what you experience. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you both for the opportunity. Yeah, it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.